You can support this project by subscribing on Spotify for £3 a month.
You are listening to the Nostalgia Podcast with myself, Brian Scarf, and this week I am rejoined by a guest we have had in the past, the independent scholar of the history of science and the Renaissance, Michal Paszkiewicz. How are you doing, Michal?
I'm very good, thank you. I'm enjoying the preparations to Christmas, and we'll be getting a tree tomorrow, and we're all looking forward to it.
Fantastic. I suppose that actually leads us into our subject today, Christmas being a period, a Christian festival that builds on a much more ancient perennial festival, which is governed to some degree by the place of the earth in its relationship to the sun, and from within the Christian religion, also the relationship between the stars and the earth. And we want to talk today about the ancient attitude towards building and orientating one's life with regards to the cosmos. So to be specific, we both live in Britain, a land that's covered in ancient landmarks, long barrows, henges, standing stones, and all sorts of other mysterious earthworks. The Tor, obviously, at Glastonbury is perhaps the most spectacular of all of which have interesting and mysterious alignments to the cosmos. And this is something that in your studies that you've sort of delved more deeply into recently. So tell me how that's come about, and what is it that has drawn you towards this question? Because I think from the skeptical modern mind, the idea that the ancients could be bothered to carefully measure out where the stars were and how they relate to the earth seems potentially a little bit too fanciful, Indiana Jones-esque. What do you think?
Well, so my interest, I've always had an interest in astronomy, I guess, and I studied physics at university, but my kind of interest in the historic astronomy didn't start till quite lately. In the last decade, when I started looking at the moon through my telescope, and I was interested in where the names of the craters came from. And from there, I found that they had been created there on the moon, these names, by the Catholic priest, Father Giovanni Battista Riccioli. And he was a Jesuit priest, he was an astronomer, and he named all of these craters by peoples who were astronomers, ancient and new. And I started translating his works because I wanted to see how he had come up with this, what he had written about these people. And ultimately, what we find is that astronomy is an incredibly ancient subject. John North, in his Cosmos, writes that astronomy has been an exact science for 5,000 years. But it's probably longer than that. That's just the written records that we have. And those are written records that we have extant today. We have ancient Mesopotamian records that show that astronomers that long ago were building models, arithmetic models of how the planets moved. They were predicting where they would be. They were observing. They were modifying their models when they found this was wrong. So they were following the scientific method, frankly, even if they weren't writing about the scientific method in a formal sense, like we find in Renaissance works. But absolutely, you're right that we are exactly in the right moment in the year to talk about these kinds of things, because Christmas is coming up. And what do we find at Christmas? We find that the birth of Christ is anticipated by a stellar phenomena, and we don't know what that stellar phenomenon necessarily was, but certainly the three kings, the three magi, were, it is written that they were following a star of some sort to get to find Jesus, and that they had a prophecy that this would mean something, that a new king would be born. And in this context, that we know that these ancient astronomers were very adept at their craft. This has a very different ring to it than what might be the common conception of what this was. But we see in Middle Eastern, in Egyptian sites, that lots of buildings were aligned with the stars. Stars had a vast meaning. They looking at the stars and predicting the yearly cycles meant life and death. It was you would plan your harvest according to the positions of the stars. You would celebrate the new year with the rising of Sirius, or as it was considered, the goddess Sopdet in Egypt, and so on. So there was a vast connection with the stars in everyday life and in all the important parts of life necessary for life. Unfortunately, I don't have access to the pyramids or any other Middle Eastern sites near me, but here I've been lately interested in long barrows, and long barrows are really interesting in that they're a very European phenomenon, and these are big sites where the dead were buried, and these are very often aligned with stellar phenomena, either the risings and settings of the stars or the sun and so on. And something that's really intriguing me about these long barrows in particular is that we have so many surviving long barrow structures, which was where they buried their dead, and we don't have so many surviving sites of where they live. And so they spent more energy into building these structures for their dead, aligned to the stars, than they did for their own homes, which I think is quite profound.
That's interesting. I was thinking as you were talking that this is something that's so hard to understand for the modern mind because we're so separated from the stars. But if you're living in a world where the material circumstances around you are chaotic and unpredictable and cruel, the study of the stars in some ways is a stepping stone out of that, because what you're studying is the predictable and unchanging world of the divine. So divine beings were seen as having their presence expressed in the stars, and the movement and the relationship between the stars and the planets were seen as expressing messages from the divine in a way that entire civilizations would orient vast amounts of energy and capital towards trying to understand. And I think that's what we're seeing the fruits of with the Magi. There's thousands and thousands of years of meditation upon these divine lights, and the fruit of it is that the one group of people in the world who are basically waiting for the Messiah, though we don't know exactly how they would have expressed it, are not the Jews. The Jews, the Hebrews, are not really sure what they're waiting for. They're waiting for a warlord. They're waiting for somebody who's going to free them from Roman dominion. But the Magi there seems to be a recognition of something very profound and very different, I would say, than the parochial view that the Hebrews had. For why else would you travel to a distant land with gifts if unless you're and not only gifts but with deeply symbolic gifts, if you are something fundamental to your religious philosophy has emerged, a message from the divine has become apparent in your times. And so I've always found that fascinating, that there really wasn't any kind of analog among the Hebrews, that there is no, whether they studied the stars or not doesn't seem relevant, in the sense that there still was no expectation among them.
Well, we do have this passage in the gospel that Herod, when meets the Magi, he consults his chief priests and asks them about the prophecy of the birth of the Messiah, and they mention that it is in Bethlehem. And I guess there is a question. Maybe they did have some way of seeing the same astrological prediction. Certainly they were influenced by Babylonian astronomy at the time. We have some evidence of that. But certainly it's true that they hadn't proactively found it like the Magi had, which is phenomenal one way or the other.
Actually, I think what you're saying is a good point. It's not unreasonable to suppose that Old Testament prophecies are instantiations of studying of the stars. So maybe there is just a mystery there for which we don't have enough data to really understand how it was that, for example, the prediction of Bethlehem came along, and maybe that really is kind of a lost knowledge at the time of the coming of Christ, which is sort of held but not fully understood.
Yep. One thing that Riccioli wrote that's perhaps interesting for this is that he mentions Solomon, King Solomon, as an astronomer, or perhaps as an astrologer. And he's basing that on the biblical reading that mentions that Solomon was given the full knowledge of the stars by God, which is a very interesting thing. What does that entail? What does it include? I'm not entirely sure, but it certainly suggests that Solomon would have been doing something with the stars. Most likely this was some form of astrology, I imagine. Of course, we don't have the details, but it wasn't written without reason, for sure.
So that's interesting, because I guess in the mind of someone like Riccioli, Solomon, who is sort of considered the wisest of the men who lived before the time of Christ, this is seen as as being expressed in his knowledge of the divine things of the stars, which seems to relate to the way that the Magi are also called wise men, and so there is this relationship between wisdom and insight into the stars, the qualitative, you might say, aspects of the celestial, the bodies.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps we should just mention about what it is about the stars that makes them so celestial, so perfect. And this is a really old tradition, the perfection of the stars. And as you said, it's entirely because they follow the paths year on year. They are the same. They have a stability to them. I think it's best actually probably summed up in the words of Javert in Les Mis. They have order and light. They know their place in the sky. They hold their course and their aim. And each in your season returns and returns, and it's always the same. A wonderful line. But this actually captures the ancient view of the stars entirely. They all had their patterns, which were arithmetic for the ancients, really ancients. Later, we had the more physical models of them, but still there was always a pattern that they follow. It was very mechanical in a way, but in a perfect sense, it was mathematical, and mathematics was always the realm of of perfection.
And to the ancient mind, it's something that the circle was the image of perfection, and even in the Ptolemaic system, when you wouldn't exactly describe all the planetary movements as circular, there was still a circular theme. as in everything returned to where it came from in a regular motion. And so this was part of the perfection of the planets and the stars, was their movement was, that ties into the predictability, because ultimately the circle is the predictable, the expression of predictability in the world outside, because you don't need to know where you are within the circle to know where its path. It's sort of at every point in the circle, you're always going the same way, in a way that no other shape does. Other shapes can be predicted, but only when you know specifically where you are, and so there's a kind of imperfection there.
Absolutely. So Aristotle wrote that there are two particular things that were perfect motions. Either it could be straight motion or circular motion, but because straight motion could never be completed, it was infinite. Because of that, the circular motion was more perfect in that it was self-completing, that it was contained in this way, and the circles were always considered perfect, and this was such a strong idea that we find that we didn't abandon circles as a core concept in astronomy until the 1600s, until Kepler. So it's a phenomenally strong idea.
What did that abandonment look like? What was the change that happened?
So Kepler observed that by looking at so just to go back a step, with Ptolemy introduced the idea of epicycles, and epicycles were circular motions around other circular motions. So you had circles upon circles, and the planet would move around a circle that moved around the Earth, and then these could stack upon each other. They didn't stack very far in the Ptolemaic model, which had a total of 34 spheres. Later we had a bit more of them. Copernicus was actually one to add spheres when he came up with his heliocentric model, with the sun at the center instead of the Earth. He also added more epicycles. The idea was that he wanted more circular motion instead of something that was called the equant. And the equant was something that they added because they noticed that planets didn't move at the same rate in their circles. So there was a second point at which they did move at a constant rate. And this required a kind of linear motion that he could replace by adding more circles, something called the Toozy couple. And so enamored was Copernicus still with the circular motion that he added more of it. When we come to Johannes Kepler, Kepler was observing Mars, and he noticed that Mars was actually following a different path than is a circle. He was following an ellipse, and he noticed this while writing his Astronomia Nova. We actually have a pretty good account of how he came up with it. It was entirely a mathematical summary of how he came up with it. But one thing that he pointed out, it's worth noting, is that an ellipse, the shape that he replaced epicycles with, can be made by two epicycles. So what he really did was he was constraining the possible arrangement of epicycles that could explain the motion of the planets. And this is of course quite interesting. But we should perhaps move back a step and go back to before Kepler, because there is something about the Ptolemaic cosmology intertwined with Aristotelian thought that's really important to understand the pre-modern view of the world. And I think something we should definitely look into is the idea of the elements. And I don't know if you know, but we had 4 or 5 elements in Europe, but in the distant Orient they had many more elements. In Europe
we're talking about earth, air, fire, water, and the quintessence, the aether.
Exactly. So one of the amusing things that I read about Jesuit missionaries who went to China or Japan is that they had dozens of different elements at that point already. And they thought that the European mind was infantile for just having the 4 or 5 elements that we thought about. Whereas here it was this idea of reducing everything to a few different elements was considered a better idea because we were simplifying everything. But all of these elements are intertwined in the cosmology of Aristotle, of Ptolemy, and with what the medievals thought. So Earth at the center of these models isn't quite right, because what was actually at the center of the universe was hell. Hell was right at the center with an eternal fire. But fire as an element wanted to go upwards. Earth went down towards the center of the universe. Water wanted to stay above the earth. Then we have air. Fire wanted to rise above. And at the top, we have the ether, the perfection in the heavens. And this was an entirely different element that they thought the stars, the planets were made of. A perfect kind of material. And until we could disengage from this theory of the elements, we couldn't actually adopt heliocentrism, which is why we don't find the scientific consensus in Europe switching to heliocentric ideas till after Newton, until all of the Aristotelian physics could actually be replaced. But perhaps you, I'm sure you know quite a bit about the elements.
Yeah, I don't want to
talk a bit about.
Go off too much on a tangent, but it does seem relevant that my co-host Sebastian has become the Wolfgang Smith Chair of Philosophy at St Mary's Twickenham, and Wolfgang Smith was very keen on moving beyond a very simplistic story of bad science developing into good science, sort of a wrong view of the universe or the cosmos as expressed through the 4 or 5 elements, being replaced by a more correct scientific view of these elemental table. In his mind, the two systems are talking about different things. The ancient elements were qualitative realities; they were essences, whereas the modern scientific mind is dealing with quantitative aspects of the world, and that actually the really subtle move for a matured scientific view that no longer sees religion as an enemy or meaning as being something separate from the world in a Cartesian way would require a reintegration of the two views, that the qualities of the elements, as was understood by the ancients, is something that it teaches us about how the world really is in a much deeper sense than a purely dead matter made of kind of infinitesimally small Lego bricks can do. And so I think he's a very interesting thinker, precisely because he doesn't give a priority to the modern worldview without denying its utility. So he says it is enormous. It is capable of producing enormous utility, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually grasped reality, because reality and utility are not. They don't follow a kind of converging path. You can make an incredible utility, for example, out of an animal. You can do things with it that the animal isn't really intended for. Often quite unpleasant things, and that would be an example of a utility, but that doesn't respect the reality of what it's being, what it should be used for. As perhaps a simple example, but he's an interesting thinker in that sense. He went as far as to say that he thought that, for example, things that were brought back from the moon, rocks that were brought back from the moon, should be understood as being qualitatively different from anything that you can find on Earth. And that it did maintain a mysterious essence that only a celestial body could give it. But it's not accessible to the kind of science that we are used to today. I suppose the question is, what kind of philosophy of science you'd have to produce to be able to integrate those two things. But that I feel like in some ways that could be a bit of a tangent. That we can recognize that there was a movement away from this older view of the 4 or 5 elements towards the modern scientific view. But for us to enter back into the ancient world view and to understand why there was such a preeminence to the celestial bodies being made of the fifth element, the aether, we can begin to understand why ancient temples and ancient burial structures were aligned with these divine signs. And it's an area that has been studied by fringe academics and thinkers much more than by the mainstream, partly because of the prejudice towards believing that we are smarter now than people were in the past. People in the past were just sort of primitives groveling around in the mud, trying to survive from day to day and seeing demons and angels behind every rock and tree, but weren't capable of higher sophisticated thought, which really isn't borne out by any dispassionate study of the data. We look back and see incredibly sophisticated thinking and what's been left behind by civilizations from thousands and thousands of years ago. Until we've unlearned it through academia leads to great awe. And so these people, when they looked at the stars and aligned their lives towards them, tried to pursue the meaning of them, held a worldview which it may seem very, very alien, but is relevant to the worldview of the early Christians, as we briefly touched upon, the star bringing people towards Bethlehem as being sort of fundamental to the nativity story. But the early Christians, once they started to build, they started to build in ways that took the relationship between the macrocosm and the microcosm very seriously. Now, partly because many of the churches were built on already established sacred sites, but also the alignment of churches. It became important to align the churches sort of from east to west, which is a very basic but obvious example of aligning the structures here on Earth towards the celestial bodies, or towards with regards to the behavior of the celestial bodies.
Yes, and the same goes in other religions. In Islam, Muslims are supposed to point their prayers towards Mecca, and it was traditional that they should know how to astronomically do this. And most of them these days will not know how to do it, but may use an app or something these days. And this is perhaps goes back to your statement about the fact that ancient thinkers did think a lot, and they didn't have Netflix or Amazon Prime to take up all their spare time. So actually, they most likely spent a lot more time thinking than the average person did today. This what you've mentioned about Sebastian, the fact that we need to have this qualitative understanding of things, not just the quantitative, is very interesting. And I think this goes also back to the ancient tradition in Christianity of the two books. It was always believed that we could discover things about God and God's nature through both scripture and through the reality we observe around us. And this is how the microcosm and macrocosm ties in as well. We can only understand things in our minds truly through analogies. And if we believe that the world has been created, it must have been created in such a way to give us some clues about God's interaction with us, about his views of us, about our relationship with him. And today, it would perhaps be surprising to find scholars writing about all the new discoveries in science in the same way that the ancients did. This is definitely something that we've lost. While we are learning more exactly about these qualitative aspects, we are losing this idea that we should also be trying to understand God through them. And perhaps we have just minute things there. We have Einstein's statement, God doesn't play dice. And that's actually quite a very simplistic statement about the field of quantum mechanics that hasn't been explored in this theological way at all.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And it would be exciting to see that happen.
Exactly as you mentioned, there are many cosmologists working today who have hold to a Christian worldview, but curiously, very, very few of them have anything to say about what they're studying other than that they have an intuition that God created it. Maybe it's the grandeur, the spectacle, the vastness. Maybe it's the fine tuning. Whatever it is, it never moves past kind of this is strong evidence for me personally of a designer, creator, God. But there's never anything further. We don't really have a conceptual framework for what you would observe in the cosmos to express something meaningful to us. Like, would it be through? Would we expect to experience dreams, for instance, like studying the stars intensively for long periods of times? Would this be something if we were to take the meaning in the cosmos more seriously as an expression of the divine logos? Would we think, I need to start recording my dreams because I'm going to be spending the next 6 months studying X or Y galaxy, and then analyzing my dreams? That's the kind of mentality I think that the ancient mind would have. It occurred to me, I was thinking about this recently, that perhaps part of the problem is our telescopes and the power of our ability to see into the very, very distant cosmology. It may be that as beings that stand between heaven and earth, kind of both having an intelligible element and a material element, that there's something very specifically very specific to the human scale and the human ability to observe, that it brings out the meaning in things, that being able to penetrate much, much further into the cosmos with telescopes doesn't in any way give you a deeper insight into the meaning. A good analogy would be that when I look at you or another human being, I can make sense of what you are in a way that if I study you under an electron microscope, it's not that I can not learn anything about you. I will certainly learn things about the composition, but the meaning of what you are and your relationship to myself, it will be completely absent, especially if I only interact with you through a very powerful microscope. There's something about my eye and my relationship to you in the scale that we are naturally that allows me to interpret your presence in the cosmos. And I wonder whether that this is the case with the celestial bodies. The ancient man didn't have telescopes, and that wasn't so much something holding him back, but rather it was something that allowed him to approach the cosmos as it was presented to a being like him, as it was intended to be presented to a being like him. And that's not to say that we should get rid of all of our telescopes, but perhaps we should consider the way that we approach the stars may be hindering our ability to interpret them. And that... Go on.
Yeah, no, this makes me think of what in cartography is considered the map maker's paradox. And this is the idea that you need to think about the scale of your map when you're making a map. And if your map is, for example, a 1-to-1 scale with reality, it becomes a useless map because you would have to walk across the map just as you walk across the actual surface of the Earth to be able to see what you want to see and where you should go. Whereas if you make the map too small and 20,000 meters is represented as 1 centimeter in your map, you might not see the detail that you want to see for a local map, for example. So at different scales, we see different things on maps. And each one of them has its purpose. You wouldn't use a local map for geopolitics. You wouldn't use a geopolitical map for land planning in your local council. There are different scales that are important for different things. And if you just concentrate on one of them, you lose the aspects of the different scales. And certainly today, astronomers are interested in looking at the unusual. What they are really doing when they're looking at the stars is they're trying to find things that will challenge the current scientific models, to expand on them, or to verify ideas that we have. And we get very good understandings of particular phenomena, particular types of stars. But certainly what is not so common now, that was common even just a few hundred years ago, is a very practical relationship with the stars, one where quite often people would know how to navigate with the stars by themselves, one where they had a kind of feeling for the stars, where they recognized the stars. Certainly we don't have that quite the same, and in fact we've actively drowned out the stars with the lights in our cities. It's quite hard to find skies dark enough to see what the ancients would have seen in the sky. And this wasn't, of course, intentional, but it's just what has happened, and we have become interested in the small, and perhaps we are losing what would have been a more natural relationship with the stars back then.
It's interesting, just to point out that we've replaced some of these important human functions with artificial means of replicating the same results, but through methods that are very, very much reflecting what they've replaced. So we can no longer see the stars, so we can no longer navigate with them. But our GPS systems are based on the triangulation of satellites, which are the closest thing to sort of man-made celestial bodies. And we have little machines that tell us where we are in relation to these artificial celestial bodies, except the human senses are no longer involved. So the relationship between this artificial celestial map and us is mediated by a digital interface, or if you want to be slightly more conspiratorial, digital egregore, which it does what we used to do, apparently much more conveniently, but separates the real human experience of relating to the cosmos from our everyday lives.
Absolutely. And you're absolutely right. I mean, in many ways, we have become better at a lot of these things, at navigation, at measuring things in the cosmos, and so on. But yes, we also have this interface between us, which has made us exactly lose that connection. Which is what you do when you get an interface, is you lose the connection. If you start talking to someone through a phone instead of face to face, then you also lose a part of that connection that you have with people. And we know this from studies now that you know, your interactions, your body, the way your body moves when you talk, the way we release pheromones, these are all important aspects of face-to-face conversation. Some of these we're missing out on. We can only see each other on a screen today, but absolutely, every time we use an interface, we lose something that was there before. The
diminution of relations, and interestingly, it seems to map very closely. It correlates quite closely to the way that we no longer consider the relations between the heavenly bodies, the planets. So ancient man wasn't simply studying the stars in isolation, but always studying how, particularly the 7 planets, related to the zodiac and to the background heavenly celestial beings, and these relations were considered fundamentally important to civilization, to religion, to society, and what we can see as technology develops, especially in the modern period, is this diminution of relations everywhere. Diminution of the celestial relations, diminution of the human relations, which seems to follow. And what's, I suppose, interesting is that identity in authentic perennial philosophy is always relational. Nothing exists outside of its relationship to others. And this is even true. I mean, it's something we've mentioned briefly on the podcast before. This is even true of God, which is why God is a trinity, that he is his relations, and there is no absolute separated anything from anything that is. The more that something is separated, the less it is.
Interesting. Yes, so certainly you talk about us as individuals, and there's something about cosmology that is really important to our understanding of ourselves, and it's quite easy to spot that as our cosmology has changed, our perspectives have also changed in quite an analogical way. One of something that Copernicus was trying to do, really, when he proposed the heliocentric system, was he was trying to remove hell as the center of the universe, with the sun, a hermetic symbol of God. And perhaps from the perspective of the early moderns, they wanted to put God at the center. And this was really important to them. This was a very important aspect to them. And they considered the center to be something good, which was unusual for the medievals, who would have, because hell was at the center for them. They wanted us to go outward into the heavens, the celestial, the perfection, which was outwards away from them. And the early moderns started looking inwardly. Now they wanted the center to be the focus. They wanted God at the center in the sun. That was now the good thing. It was the center. And this is quite a different perspective. And in a way, it was we can kind of see that in the Enlightenment authors, that they had a strong sense of looking inwards, of this individualism, of kind of heroic figures. But the shift to heliocentric galactic and then intergalactic cosmology was therefore not really a loss of our place of importance. Rather, it is a shift where we have moved from what was a place close to hell to a place of indifference, which is perhaps a place of even greater despair. And it's entirely linked to the rise of individualism. We once had a desire to reach outwardly, and that with a greater goal, we always looked outwards into this greater goal. But now we have our own relative place in an enormous universe, but where each place is just as meaningless as the next. And the Christian perspective has always actually had an answer to both of these kind of secular cosmological scenarios. If you look at Psalm 8, verse 4, it's, For I will behold thy heavens, the works of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast founded. What is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou visitest him? Thou hast made him a little less than the angels, thou hast crowned him with glory and honor. And this is just as applicable now as it was for the ancients. For them, we were, what is man? What this thing near hell? And now it is even greater, perhaps. What are we? This speck of nothing in this unimaginably huge universe that God should be mindful of us.
Your description of moving from the earth as being close to hell as at the center towards a kind of metaphysical nihilism actually isn't such a great shift, I suppose, in some ways, because sort of the absolute meaninglessness and nothingness of hell, and rejecting sort of the love of God, and by association the logos, which gives things meaning and order and harmony, is very much hellish. I suppose the difference is that in embracing this reorientation in understanding our position in the world, and the sort of indifference between where we are here and anywhere else in the cosmos, hell is everywhere. And so in the past, there weren't really dreams of going to other stars, but there were constant dreams of trying to build things on Earth to reflect the stars, to take the beauty and the permanence and the harmony of the spheres and bring them to Earth. And the modern world no longer sees eternity and beauty and harmony in the spheres, but desperately wants to go there and leave the kind of destruction and nihilism that we're creating on Earth for essentially more destruction and nihilism elsewhere in the cosmos. The rapacious need for more material kind of hides the fact that there's no belief that anything will ever be any different anywhere else. Whether it's Musk who wants to go to Mars, then there's no suggestion that life will ever be more meaningful. It may just be richer.
Yes. And we don't consider the stellar stability either. We don't build things to be permanent anymore. We build high rises. We still build outwards to the heavens, but more as an ego trip, or as a practical way of fitting more space in a limited amount of space. But when we build buildings, we think about kind of lifetimes of these buildings, and we plan that they will probably be removed, destroyed within a few hundred years, and then we'll erect new ones. There's none of this idea that, let's try and build cathedrals that are built out of solid stone that will stand for millennia, if possible. We've entirely lost this idea of permanence, and it's pretty clearly linked to this fact that we don't see things as so permanent anymore. Everything's dynamic and in motion.
And I wonder whether this brings us back to our original opening thoughts on the way that something like a long barrow or other funerary monuments were so central to civilization. There's a complete inversion to what we have today, where the places where people are buried are kind of forgotten about and legally can't be bulldozed over, but in our minds are removed from the everyday world, and the least permanent things, like the creation of wealth and capital, are dominating our city landscapes. So in the past, the conceptual passage from the life of impermanence and change here into a greater relationship, whichever way that's expressed religiously, there was still a fundamental intuition of some kind of relations, at least for some, perhaps not for everyone, but for some, to the heavenly bodies. A kind of hope, perhaps, and this is why maybe the barrows and other monuments to fallen great men, priests, kings, were aligned to the stars, because of a desire to have the soul go to its resting place in the stars, however that was conceptualized. Whereas today, the least permanent things are the objects of all of our civilizational effort,
and it dominates everything. If you read the newspapers, what's on the front pages? It's the football matches, it's the politics. These are things that may last a day, may last a year at most. It's absolutely impermanent. If you want something more permanent, you need to really go around the edges of society and become unique in your own way, and look for things that others aren't.
And interestingly, the football stadiums or skyscrapers in financial districts are by far the most expensive objects that our civilizations build now, whether it's like the next mega tall structure that an emirate might be looking to build in the Middle East, or whether it's just an upgraded football or American football stadium where the sums are truly eye-watering, and they don't have any relationship to any cosmic meaning. They have no other function than to either entertain people or to produce wealth creation. But both of those things, to the mind of ancient man who's looking up at the stars, would have really would have been considered at the low priorities to civilization. I won't say that there were no priorities at all. Of course, there were always markets and there were always merchants, but in the structure of castes, whether sort of more explicitly as in the Indian system or just implicitly as found elsewhere, the merchant was never seen as anything more than an unpleasant necessity to just to make sure that sort of people can be fed, but that the structure of society wasn't built around it. It didn't really relate to anything that you saw in the stars, whereas the warrior caste and the priest caste did have expressions in the stars. I mean, the stars were the stories of sacred things and of warfare and of sacred warfare. And likewise, the kind of entertainment that we see in our football stadiums, ancient man would have, and I think you can see this in sort of Mesoamerica, where there are sporting events, but they are heavily integrated into the economy of sacrifice and religion. If I've remembered correctly, I think that there were competitions where the losing side would end up being sacrificed. This just a mindset which we can't grasp, because we can no longer conceptualize eternity. I think this is even true for religious people. We don't see the stars. We say the words and we grasp things notionally, to borrow a concept from St. John Henry Newman, but we don't have a real appreciation for eternity, for the unchanging. Even when we discuss the cosmos, at the back of our minds are the doctrines of the scientists, which tell us even the stars are not permanent, that the stars will die out and the universe will go through a heat death. Regardless of whether we can actually really know such things, that is the conceptual framework within which we live. So whenever we use the religious term eternity in sort of a Christian context, we are so divorced from any kind of deep understanding of what we're dealing with. And then we kind of devolve into, it's a very long period of time that never ends, the best that we can do, which is sort of the total domination of quantity to eternity. We have no ability to really see eternity through a qualitative lens. And this is why I think we can't even make sense of the sayings of Christ. He talks of sort of having real life, or having true life, life everlasting. It's not the emphasis is not on the everlasting in a way that life. So you can emphasize the concept of everlasting in terms of temporal permanence, and think of life as just this endless continuation of what we're doing now, but just nicer. But sort of a qualitative approach to eternity and a qualitative approach to life itself opens the doorway to a very strange pathway that can give us an explanatory framework for why none of this is ever going to be boring or monotonous, because there's a depth to things. It's not simply doing what we do now, but nothing's really painful and it goes on for forever, and it's sort of we're always happy and we get our dopamine rush. The completeness of the celestial spheres that the ancient man would have understood when he looked up at the stars, a kind of perfection which is qualitative, is what we struggle so much to grasp in a non-qualitative civilization by the terms eternal life.
I think that there is a struggle whatsoever for modern man to think about perfection itself, and we can see this in the literature, in the films that come out today. It is the absolute abandonment of perfection that people want to see. We see the Tolkien of the past, where there was a good that could be strived for, an ending that could resolve itself. Someone that could be a good king at the end of a book is something that isn't palatable to people today so much. Now we see the rise in popularity of things like Game of Thrones, where there is no satisfactory ending because the whole story is imperfect. Everyone is flawed to ridiculous extents, far beyond how we are flawed in reality. It is in these flaws that people find their amusement, and ultimately there can never be a satisfactory ending to a story like Game of Thrones, precisely because there is no perfection that can be found in this arrangement, nothing that will satisfy a reader who craves the imperfection in that story.
I wonder whether that's also linked to our inability to interpret things qualitatively. Our obsession with equality, for example, a concept of perfection which prioritizes qualities would see things differentiate, become more different, individuation, exaggerate the differences in some way, to bring the particular thing out of a person, which makes them unique and different. I mean, people like to use the concept of uniqueness, but it always kind of comes within a framework of everything is always ultimately the same. Everyone is always ultimately the same. But real perfection moves away from sameness and to real difference in a hierarchy of one so at the end of the Lord of the Rings, exactly as you say, it's not knowing how to deal with someone becoming a king when absolutely everybody else is not a king and is in some ways a servant in relation to that king, but then with sub-hierarchies beneath, sort of aristocrats and lords. This is how you would intuit the world if your world was dominated imaginatively by the stars. Some stars are greater and some stars are lesser, but the ideal is not that all stars shine exactly the same, and that there's no that's not the ideal at all. But to the modern mind, the ideal is that there is no difference in terms of a hierarchical difference, and in reality that there should be as little difference in the kind of interior essential disposition of the person as well, because that's a form of tyranny, because to be this and not that is in the mind of the modern man a restriction. But ultimately it devolves into, just like you say in Game of Thrones, an inability to resolve itself. Even on the personal level, you see it everywhere. You see young men unable to make decisions as to their future, partly because they have so many choices. No, we've never had so many options available to us, and it's never been so difficult to know how to unfold your life, because choice has been sold as a kind of freedom, but it doesn't seem to fit into an authentic anthropology, where rather than authoring yourself, perhaps the distinction being the one of authoring oneself and discovering oneself. And if you live in a society where you are an expression of the cosmos, in a condensed form, the microcosm macrocosm relationship, to study the stars, to study the eternal things, is to discover things about yourself. You don't have to make yourself up from. There's no blank slate. You're not an author sitting at a table with a book, and you have to invent something from nothing. You are discovering, and I suppose this is the genius. The genius of an authentic writer is that he is kind of led by his story. He discovers it, and the writers who are inventing from nothing in an attempt to rid themselves of cliches and structures end up with stories that feel hollow. I know I got this impression when I remember a few years ago I tried reading some of Murakami's books, and you come away with this impression that there's a great deal of impressive inventiveness to the narrative, and yet at the end there's a kind of emptiness and vacuum to the storytelling that in some ways I think reflects the modern world, and that I think explains the popularity, because from that perspective he's a good mirror to modern man, but it does make it feel a little bit like you've eaten some food which is a fake. You might like fake meat is perhaps a really good analogy. Is like somebody could come up with even if someone was successful in coming up with a way of replicating burger meat that had no animal protein in it, I like to think that human beings would always have an intuition, healthy human being would always have an intuition that something wasn't quite right, even if they weren't sure what it was. Because that is the necessary outcome of a world, or of a cosmos that has essences. There are things that the quantities that we are exposed to do not exhaust. And I think this applies to so many things in modern life, especially a modern life where we're increasingly exposed to strange forms of computing, which increasingly could deceive one into thinking that they were dealing with a human being.
Yes. No, interesting. Something I thought when you were talking about this, I was thinking about rulership, and we don't have any shared view of there being a possible rulership that could in any way be truly satisfactory. Obviously, we are quite polarized as a society right now, but it's this obsession with imperfection, the obsession with qualitative features that mean we can never be satisfied with a superior. And what I mean by that is we see in ancient texts that people crave for a wise ruler, someone that could resolve a dispute wisely. And we see this in how people wrote about Solomon or about medieval kings. It was this aspect that you would hope for, that your ruler would be able to resolve things with wisdom. Now we don't have a concept like this, because if someone is ruling, if someone is superior to you, you will always, in a sophistic way, find ways in which they are flawed, in which they have not satisfied everyone, in how one decision has hurt others. And certainly to some extent, quantitatively, that's always going to be true. You're always making trade-offs in politics. At the same time, we've entirely abandoned the idea that there could be some kind of wisdom, that there could be a good decision-making process. And this makes it impossible to have a satisfactory superior, to have any kind of order in our society, which relies on a structure that we follow.
So the reigning paradigm of rulership is that power corrupts, which precludes the possibility of the good use of power. The idea of a wise ruler is naive. History, according to this way of approaching things, demonstrates that power is always used for self-enrichment, self-aggrandizement, and that the concept of a good ruler is very childish. I think once again it's going back to our understanding of the stars. We don't have an imaginary for something reaching for perfection, or to organize a society according to a set of principles beyond the chaos of nature. So we're stuck with the corruption of the world around us, and the spheres have gone silent, gone dark, actually, if you want to be a bit more specific. And so I think in some ways this is why I think so many people who have a desire for something spiritual but maybe don't have any attachment to any religious institution often become very interested in the alignment of ancient structures. It's a part of many different aspects of the New Age. The going on a pilgrimage to places of celestial importance, and this is particularly true in our country where we live, in a place like Glastonbury, which is seen as being aligned not only where it is specifically its structures, but also within the ley line, all the way from Land's End deep into the eastern parts of England, and there's this intuition that the people who built these things and took took the alignment of the stars so seriously that they wanted to have their lives lived according to it, that there's still a draw towards that. You may not want doctrines or dogmas or official institutional rituals, but you want this sense of meaningfulness. It's kind of like a meaning maximalism, that the whole cosmos has a message for our lives. We don't know what it is. We don't even want to attempt to systematize it too much, but we could embody acting out some of its principles by walking the paths, by visiting sites that reflect those truths, whatever they are. And I think that's something that would be really good to see return to Christianity. It kind of is latent there in our great monuments, in the cathedrals, in the pilgrim ways, but it's totally alien to the modern approach of Christianity, which pays lip service to a meaningful cosmos, but yet has nothing to say in what those meanings might be. There are no bestiaries being produced. We know more about animals and we know more of the animals than at any other time in history, and nobody has produced a book meditating, contemplating on the meaning of those animals. And we have photographs of galaxies that are millions of light years away, and nobody has produced a book on what they might actually have to teach us. But I would, if there's something I would want people to take away from this conversation, from the podcast in general, is that there's no good reason why that can't be resurrected. Science doesn't challenge. It has nothing to say on this. It may make a kind of proclamation that there is no meaning, but that's simply ideology. If you do believe that there is meaning in the cosmos, then science is in no way a barrier to investigating what that is. And it may be the simple contemplation of something here on Earth, an animal or a plant, or if you're fortunate enough to live somewhere where you can contemplate the heavenly bodies, that would be no small calling to spend your time trying to find ways to embody that on Earth. You may not be able to build a henge, but you may be able to build a Mary garden, and it may be able to reflect these deep principles.
I wonder if the fact that we aren't producing such materials is because science itself feels so impermanent, in the sense that in astronomy, for example, we had the geocentric model replaced with the heliocentric. Then we discovered galactic motion. And perhaps the feeling now is any kind of attempt to find meaning in what we know about the universe today can be pulled out from under us like a rug, and that we will lose that meaning if that happens. But actually, I think that's the wrong attitude, because we do science precisely because we know that we will discover new things. And that doesn't make the science itself meaningless. And similarly, anything that progresses from that science isn't meaningless in its own self either. What we really want to be doing is to be advancing every aspect of our knowledge with every new discovery. And instead, we've kind of abandoned a whole pipeline of creation because we're worried about the fact we might have to change it again. When, of course, we might have to change it, because, of course, we might discover something new. And this has always been an aspect that we must have had considered, because we're always learning. Even in the sphere of religion, there are visions, there are all sorts of things that happen that allow us to learn new things. And we can't abandon the idea of qualitative interpretations of reality around us just because we're worried that might change.
Well, it's interesting. I think perhaps would be a good thought to leave it on. That the modern science, even though its investigations of the natural world and the cosmos is primarily, if not exclusively, quantitative, the narratives that bind the data together are the replacement of qualities. Science isn't simply a presentation of data. It is bound together with a story. When you open, whether it's Nature Journal or any of the other, even the more technical science journals, It's not simply a presentation of data. It is that there is analysis and interpretation and a binding together, and it's that's changing. Sure, data can be mistaken, but there are pieces of data which are fundamentally unchangeable, like to some degree. But what science is constantly doing is changing the narrative, because either new data is found that challenges it, but those narratives in and of themselves are a replacement for the deeper insights of a kind of sacred narrative, and so to reintegrate these now highly separated categories would be where at least I would encourage the scientifically minded. I know that not everyone approaches the world with a kind of priority towards hazy mysticism. There are people whose instincts are for the rigor of observation and a more scientific way of viewing things, and yet the step beyond that is to reintegrate the things that we intuitively know to be true because we can't live without them, which are the qualitative relations that we use on a daily basis, and to no longer treat those as an exception and reintegrate them into the scientific mind and the scientific pursuit and worldview.